Last night at about 7:30, one of the Episcopal priests from the United States that I follow on Twitter tweeted out, "The deacons should start reading today's gospel now so that we can get it done in time." Lord have mercy, that was a long reading. Anyway. The other news that I want to tell you before I get into the sermon, because it kind of relates to the sermon. If you haven't heard, the merger agreement passed all of the lawyers. Okay? So we've actually got a merger agreement to vote on. So I don't know if we thank God, thank bishops, thank lawyers, whoever, just we're happy. Anyway. Later this morning, the members of Holy Cross will vote on that merger agreement. Our annual meeting of members will consider the agreement that is drafted between Holy Cross and St. Elizabeth's, the Eastern Synod of the ELCIC, and the Synod of the Diocese of Niagara. No wonder it took so long to do. For me, though, this is a day that is about 10 years in the making. You might think that it's been a shorter period of time, as our formal conversations have been much shorter than 10 years, although there were days that it felt that long. The pandemic did not make this merger agreement negotiation easy. I'll admit there were points when I thought that we wouldn't see this day happen. Not because there was a lack of goodwill or lack of desire, but it just seemed at times that the process dragged on. I've been saying, though, to the people of Holy Cross for at least the last 10 years, that you need to be in partnership with someone about something. I've tried really hard not to specify what that something was and who that someone was. But I've known that this has been our reality for at least that long of time. It's important that we find a way to move forward with our own choices in life, with our own understanding of who God is calling us to be. 10 years ago, I would not have thought that this merger was even an option. I mean, I know that it was, because I followed the full communion agreement from before it was written. Our one-time pastor here was one of the first people to start conversations between Lutherans and Anglicans. Michael Price and Ralph Spence started to talk, started to get to know each other across denominational lines. While it was possible 10 years ago, it was possible in 2001. I never would have thought 10 years ago that it would have been this reality, that this would be how God would be calling us to be faithful. Often when we read the scriptures, we look for some deep meaning in the story. We want to know, how does it impact our life? Thousands of years after the story has been told or the words have been written, we look for clues as to what the teaching of Jesus is and what the implication of that teaching has for how we live as God's faithful people. We know in today's story that Jesus is walking along and his disciples ask him about who sinned, the man born blind or his parents. For in that worldview, physical disabilities were a sign of God's punishment. Oh, I am so thankful that 2,000 years later we don't believe that. Or at least I hope we don't believe that. Right? But that was the thought of the day. Jesus says that it's neither the parents nor the man who sinned, and that there's another purpose to the man's blindness. After some interaction with the Pharisees, Jesus leaves us with the teaching that those who claim to be God's people, in other words, us, we, like the Pharisees, might be spiritually blind. But what does it mean to be spiritually blind? We know the Ten Commandments. We know the summary of the law that Jesus gave. We know that there are church and publicly acceptable moral standards. We spend time in prayer. We come here for communion. We read the scriptures on our own. How could we ever possibly be spiritually blind? Well, one of the things that happened during the pandemic was that I worked more and more from home. And at times, the quietness of the house would be distracting. So I did what I used to do as a teenager that my parents hated. I'd put on the TV while I worked. One of the shows that I would regularly listen to, not watch, but listen to, is Father Brown. Right? The story of a priest who solves mysteries, right? And one of the things that I've learned from that show is that in order to understand what is really going on, we need to see the things that other people do not see. And as I read today's gospel reading, something wasn't in the commentaries, but stood out for me. As he walked along, Jesus saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him." Now, I know that these stories were written at the time of Jesus, and they may have been adapted by their particular authors. But what struck me was how the meeting of Jesus and the man born blind happened. It's almost as if it was by chance. Imagine for a moment if Jesus had have walked down another road. Imagine for a moment if the disciples had not asked the question. Imagine for a moment if the man were not feeling well and just wasn't there that day. Then none of this teaching, none of this healing would have happened. Lives would not have been changed. Part of me wonders what other coincidences are discarded by us over the years. What if I never picked up the phone when Ken and Susan and Ken and Kristen wanted to first meet about pursuing merger? What if I said, "I left the diocese a good number of years ago and I don't want to go back"? What if we had given up in the midst of the pandemic when the process was a lot more difficult than it really ever needed to be? What if back in 2001, our two national denominations hadn't signed the agreement in the most Canadian of places, center ice of a hockey rink? True, true. What if the one-time pastor of Holy Cross and the one-time rector of St. Luke's had never become friends, had never become bishops, had never become the forces to see this unfold? We can push all of those decisions off as simple decisions made by people. Or maybe we can see it as the work of the Spirit of God putting opportunities in our path to engage with and to maybe change the world. So, at our annual meeting of members, Holy Cross will vote on the merger agreement that we've drafted. You'll get your opportunity, St. Elizabeth's folk, soon, right? Our synod councils will have their opportunity to vote as well. Just as the man born blind could have carried on without washing in the pool of Siloam, we too as congregations can carry on without merging, although financially it's going to be tough. But in reality, we could. It would just be a different way. Just as the man born blind took the risk that going to the pool to wash was actually going to work, we too are faced with a decision. Are we willing to take the risk to see that this merger will work? The man born blind was open to the working of God's Spirit in his life. I hope we are too.